When Luther posts those 95 Theses on the doors of the church there at Wittenberg, his intent is not to create a new church. His intent was instead to look at the Catholic Church and say, these are areas where we have gone astray. We'll use that nice biblical word. Point out for you in your textbook on 216, they have some of the 95 Theses. He is especially looking at the indulgences, those pardons that were being sold. The idea of the indulgences being sold, especially by the Germanic priests, upset Luther, because he knew that the money was not being kept to help out locally. They weren't selling this and then using the money to help out with the poor, the needy, the situations that might be beneficial to the parishioners there within their own area. The money was being sent back to Rome to help the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, to help reconstruct the church there that had been damaged and needed to be remodeled. Luther said, no, if we're going to take money, we need to do something else with it. We need to use it for those who really need it. He goes, there's no point in doing this. And I told you that one of them talked about, someone who helps out a poor man or a needy man does much better for his soul than buying a pardon. Now, just because you have this piece of paper saying, oh, I'm forgiven of a sin, that does not mean that you are forgiven of a sin. His view becomes very much a problem for the leaders of the Catholic Church because of the invention of the printing press, of course. It allows his 95 Theses to be set in print and to be printed. And the next thing you know, there are copies of it going across Europe. I'm not sure if you remember from the video, it talked about hundreds of thousands of copies. The estimation are over 500,000 copies of the 95 Theses made their way around Europe. Well, that's a substantial amount, reaching a substantial number of people. The result is that this attitude of we need to do better, Luther's view, caused the church to take some steps. And eventually, of course, he was excommunicated. And by 1525, he has left the church fully, marries a former nun, as the video told you, marries a former nun, and he goes about establishing followers who also mirror his views and values. The pastors, as they're now called, of the Lutheran followers, they're allowed to marry. Sacraments are done away with except for two, and that's going to be baptism and communion. And it's going to be that, especially communion, that really causes an issue between Calvin, who comes after Luther, and the people who follow Martin Luther. Luther, as the Catholic Church also believed, insisted that the communion became real. That once you took the wafer into your body, it became the real flesh of Christ. That once you drank the wine, once it entered your body, it became the real blood of Christ. It transmuted. The Calvinists and some of the other Protestant, those who also now are called Protestants, took the position that was more symbolic than real. And that causes issues between the two. But they are still doing this very moral attitude. With Luther, he says that man does not need an intercessor. Man can seek his own salvation and own forgiveness of sin. That is justification by faith. You may remember that phrase that we used in the video. That faith is what leads to salvation. The Calvinists are going to go with that as well. They're going to say that justification by faith is important. Faith is what leads to salvation. But once you are saved, once you are one of the intended, the elect, the selected, then your life should mirror a very moral stance. That you will not, I think in your book it talks about how the civic leaders of Geneva, who follow Calvin, they take over Geneva as the civic leaders. They outlaw drinking and dancing and swearing and public displays of affection. It's not that that's going to get you to heaven, but it's going to show that you are intended for heaven. That God has chosen you, you know how God wants you to live, so you're not going to do these things. It's not that that gets you to heaven, because that's not how you get to heaven. In the Calvinist attitude and some of the other Protestant religions, God predestines you. And you have a little blurb about predestination in your book also, I think on 217. So that it's not that you work your way to heaven, but so just because you don't drink, don't swear, doesn't mean you get to go. But if you have been selected by God to go, then you don't drink, you don't swear. So it's sort of a little discrepancy there at times. But this is a key aspect that we see within the religious aspect. At the same time that this is going on, yes, 217 is where Calvinist predestination. Same time this is going on, and you had in the video again, you had a comment about Luther reacting to Erasmus, one of the great thinkers of this era. At the same time, this Protestant Reformation, the focus on the church, the focus on man's morality and his stance with God is taking place. You also have, in the northern part, just as in the Italian area, you have great thinkers, individuals who are looking at and trying to evaluate their world and what the world is like, trying to figure out about not only religion, because that is a part of it, again, because the Catholic Church is such a predominant aspect of life on a daily basis, but also about government. What should government be? With Calvin, his followers felt that government should mirror their religious attitudes. Others hold to the separation of the church and state, and we saw that phrase in the book as well. One of the great thinkers of the era is an individual, this is mentioned on 219 in your book, Desiderius Erasmus. And you're all going, what a name. Yes, I know. He's an individual who offers for us this profound concept. He's called, on page 215, they refer to him, this is where I was looking for that, the Prince of Humanists. He was the first humanist to make extensive use of the printing press. A neoclassicist, wrote everything in Greek and Latin. Thought the church had lost its focus on faith. Did a critical edition of the New Testament, which meant not only did he translate it, he offered comments about it. He also was correcting some of the issues he felt. There had been another translation earlier in your book mentions that one, and there had been mistranslations, so he corrected those. He was a scholarly individual from Rotterdam, Holland, as we call her, the Netherlands now, and becomes one of the leading minds of this era. He and Thomas More, who's also mentioned on 219, have exchanges, and part of what Erasmus does, and this is where we have this reference on 219, that a typical Northern Renaissance theme is something that he looks at. The vast gulf between human fallibility and human perfectibility. He wrote a work, a satire, called The Praise of Folly, where he looks at the idea about human greed, human intellectual, what's called pomposity, and excessive pride or arrogance. This idea of in Erasmus' view is that man has allowed himself to think so much of himself that he fails to realize he's not that significant after all. And so he writes The Praise of Folly, in which he basically lambasts how man is. All these great intellectuals who are offering all these wonderful comments out of Italy, he says, what have you really accomplished? Not much of anything. As I said, he and Thomas More were very close friends. They exchanged, having a lively correspondence. When he writes the praise of folly, and this is mentioned in your book. He dedicates the book to Thomas More, using the Latin Moria, because of course, or actually it's Greek, but Moria I think is Latin, but More is also Greek. Because of course he thought that worked out really well, because M-O-R, how many of you are sophomores here in college? All right, okay, so now you know what you are, right? Soph means wise or wisdom. More means fool, foolish. So you are wise fools. Because more, same word as used in the word moron, same word. And so he thought it was a little play off of Thomas More's name to dedicate his praise of folly, praise of foolishness, to Thomas More, whose last name actually could be considered to be foolish, although they were close friends. They had a nice little joke about that. But that's a very common theme in the Northern Renaissance, to look at man and say, how foolish are we? We think we're so wonderful, we think we're accomplishing so much, but are we really? Some of that is that humanist attitude, although Erasmus himself is called the Prince of Humanists in your book, and that is the name he's given. But he felt that that still should be in light of the religion of the era, that we cannot exceed what God has blessed us with. And that some of the humanists take it too far, that we don't need God, we don't need religion, man is capable of being wonderful and great and doing everything on his own. And that's where Erasmus comes and says, no, we can't. That's pushing us too far. That's going to the extreme. Man becomes foolish when we do that. You have an excerpt from Praise of Folly. I'm not going to read it to you, but one part does make this comment. For medicine, especially as now practiced by many, is but a subdivision of the art of flattery, no less truly than is rhetoric. Lawyers have the next place after doctors, and I do not know but that they should have the first place. With greater unanimity, the philosophers, not that I would say such a thing myself, are wont to ridicule the law as an ass. Yeah, you know, we always talk about doctors and lawyers and the respect they gain. If somebody tells you he's a doctor or she tells you she's a lawyer, we always have great respect for them. You know, that's a position that, oh, when you're older and you have children, if your child comes, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, think, oh, that's a great view. Erasmus didn't think much of doctors and lawyers. He said they'll tell you what you want to hear, and that's about it. If you'll remember in Chaucer in 1380, so it's 100 plus years before Erasmus is writing this, the doctor who's presented in the Canterbury Tales prologue, his description is he has a special love for gold. He does everything because of money, and that he offers his prescriptions by astrology. Not necessarily how you want to have your illnesses determined, but that's what Chaucer was looking at, saying, look out, what we're going to doctors for. Well, Erasmus felt the same about many of these professions that had started developing, and he said, this is not how they are, and not how they should be, because man has allowed himself to be betrayed by his own folly. More writes about that as well. More writes a work called Utopia. Anybody here ever had to read Utopia? Okay. It's a book. Yeah. So I told you, folks, get ready. You're in a class with an English teacher now, so Well, good, because I'm about to talk about Shakespeare too. And you're all going, great. We were trying to get out of taking World Lit. That's why we took this Humanities class. Yeah, I know. You don't get out of it at all. So Thomas More's Utopia is an interesting book because you're never quite sure, is he serious about this or is he not? How much of it is he really making fun of government? And how much is he really being serious about it? Because utopia is a word he coined. There was no word utopia, really. He just coined it. Top means place. Okay? And you, if you take it as being EU, a Greek prefix, it means good. So good place. But it also can be you, as in we typically see it as UN, meaning none or no. It could mean no place. So we're not sure if he's writing about no place or a good place. And of course, many people have seized upon utopia as being the good place, the best possible world, and therefore we wound up with dystopia, bad place, and you have dystopian literature. I noticed a commercial because I've been watching television recently since I can't do anything else. Another Divergent movie is coming out. Okay, right? There's another one coming out. Allegiant, is that the last one? Okay. Again, I haven't been. Divergent, that series, and The Hunger Games, that series, are examples of dystopian literature, where they present you a world that is flawed, not perfect. And that's what dystopian literature is, which is actually a reaction to what Moore does with Utopia, where he shows you a perfect society. But it's really not that perfect. You had a question, go ahead.
What was the movie called?
I think it's called Allegiant, isn't it? Divergent is the series of books, and then you had, what's the first one called? Is it just Divergent? And the second was Insurgent. Okay, and the third one's Allegiant, right? Okay, I got that down. Haven't read that series, sorry. I guess I should. I'm not going to see the movies, but at least I can read the books. When Moore offers us Utopia, he gives an individual who is the narrator, who is telling you about this place, and that individual is talking with a character whose name happens to be Thomas More. It's like, okay, Moore's writing about himself. No, he creates a character called Thomas More, same name, who meets an individual while he is in Amsterdam because More worked for the government under Henry VIII, and he said he met this. So he writes this book about a conversation with an individual who tells him about this land he has seen. He also makes the first part of the book is a commentary about government in Europe, about why is government set up this way. Are we really having the right people rule? These ideas about people inheriting a throne, and therefore they are qualified to lead because they inherited the throne. The individual telling the story questions that. He goes, is that really how you're supposed to choose your leaders? Is that how we should choose any sort of leader in the world? Is simply by having that individual. Hitler Day. I want to make sure I got that one. I want to make sure I got the translation of it right. So the individual who's telling all this his name is called Raphael Hythloday, and the translation of that name Hythloday, and that's what I was making sure I had it, is a speaker or talker of nonsense. So it's like, are we supposed to take this seriously when he makes these comments, or is it just foolishness again, more foolishness? So Moore has Hythloday off this really strong indictment about the way European countries are ruled, making a commentary about government. Now remember, Moore is part of the royal court of Henry VIII when he's writing this. So it's not quite an indictment of Henry VIII, but he is making a strong indictment about how leaders are chosen and how they're not always qualified. And then Hythloday, in the book, gives him a description of this perfect society that he ran into called Utopia. Utopia is set somewhere over in the New World. You're not quite sure where it is. The New World is just 1492, so this is only 50 years or so. Actually less than that, because Utopia was published. Let me get the date on that again. Your book tells you. Excuse me. Thank you. 1516. I want to make sure I have the right date. So we're talking 20-something years, only a quarter of a century since the New World technically had been found. Is when he writes this. So it's still not everybody knows everything about the New World. So there could be a place like Utopia over there, he thinks. So he offers that view. And it's described as a society where they have a certain number of city-states set up, and the population of the city-states are controlled. Only so many people can live there. Only the number of population that they're put into households, and once a household gets too many people, then they are sent away. You have they have some who go across because they've dug basically a trench that now separates them from the mainland, so they have to send them over to the mainland to establish colonies there. But they control their population, and they control every aspect. Everybody has to work. Every person has to work. You have to have some job. There is no separation of that, and everyone in a 2-year cycle will be working farms, because agriculture is the main aspect of their culture. So everybody's going to have to work on the farm every 2 years. They also can practice some other aspects. When it says when one city has an agricultural surplus, it exports with no charge to its neighbors, and the same is done in return. If you remember, again, how many of you have ever read The Hunger Games, or at least saw the movies? Okay. Remember how each of the districts has a specialty, and that they're supposed to collect what it is and send them to the other ones? That comes from Utopia, folks. Suzanne Collins is borrowing from Utopia when she does that. Now that certain people specialize in certain skills, what is it, Peter, Stanley, or Bakers, right? Man, saying Peter. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Peter. What? Well, it's not Peter. It's Peter. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I bet that didn't sound right. Something like that. I was close. It's been a long time since I read those books. I actually did read them. I don't watch the movies. Sorry. I read the books, which they change up. I did see part of one of the movies and went, that's not how it goes. So, okay. But you should have some specialty. Well, you could have a second specialty as well, and you would use those in Utopia. I mean, that's literally, she's drawing very strongly from Utopia for some of those aspects. The households are split into groups of 30. That's what I was looking at. And you have, in that one, they choose somebody who's going to oversee it. And then you have, for every 10 of those, there's a one that's chosen above that, and they serve on committees. And they operate with that one and can change. Utopians think of the land as something to be worked rather than to be owned. And that's part of what we see. Remember when we talked about the feudal system that we saw arising in the Middle Ages? And also I commented about, I believe, on Tuesday when we were talking about Henry VIII and Edward VI, his son, taking over, and he was only 9 years old. Remember I talked about that? You go, sure we do. It's fresh in our memory. And how because he's only 9, his uncles basically take over running the country as regents, and they run it as a capitalistic endeavor, because that's what they were. They were merchants. They sold titles and they sold land that had been given to the church, because the church, of course, held it if it didn't own anybody else. And they sold that because land is something that's a commodity. Well, this is part of what we see, this attitude about owning land and selling land. Now, this is before, of course, the Seymours had taken over. But the same attitude was already being pervasive. You were having people selling and buying property. Well, in Utopia, the land is communal. Everybody has land. It's all Utopia. So therefore, it's no one person's land. Says that the economic structures, markets, and money do not exist in Utopia. Everyone is provided for. And some people say, of course, he's an early forerunner of communism, because some of that sounds as if that's what communism is like. We'll get to that when we get to the end of the book. But what he also offered was that they controlled every aspect of life. For instance, they fought wars. There were other countries around, they had to fight wars. But they preferred not to fight wars because Utopia was a very wealthy country. They would sometimes just buy off the other side. Okay, what if we gave you gold? Because they didn't need money. Everybody was sharing. So this money stockpiled because they would produce more than enough for themselves, so they would sell it to other countries who might need what they were producing. And so they stockpiled all this money. So they would sometimes just buy off their enemies. Here, we'll just, we'll give you money, just leave us alone. But sometimes that didn't work. So they would then just hire mercenaries to go fight for them. There were always people who'd be willing to fight for you if you pay them enough. So here, we're going to pay you to go fight for us. But occasionally they did have to fight wars. And when they did, when they would win, they would take the other people as slaves. Slavery was part of it. They were captured in battle, or anyone who commits a crime in Utopia could be turned into a slave. Murder. If you killed someone, you could actually be killed for that. But if you did horrible crimes, you could actually be put into the situation of being a slave for the rest of your life. Sometimes they would have refugees come to them, fleeing from other countries. Bless you. They would flee from other countries to Utopia because I've heard about this great life. Well, only utopians can be utopians, but they would let the other ones be slaves. And the slaves are actually fairly well cared for, but they are also always chained. One other aspect, that part of it, was that they did receive care if they were sick. When people, though, were terminally ill, the doctors, and they had priests. They allowed religion to be sort of free. They had priests for that. Government leaders would urge patients to recognize, since you cannot help us anymore, since you're no longer contributing to Utopia and you're a drain on us, the best choice for you, die. Euthanasia was practiced in Utopia. Now, you can imagine that's controversial. He's writing this in 1517, folks. 400 years ago. Oh, excuse me, 500 years ago. And likewise, they controlled other aspects. Every aspect of life was controlled in Utopia. A man could not marry until he reached the age of 22. A woman had to be 18. Okay? So, no premarital sex was allowed at all. And when a young man was going to marry a young woman, they each had the right to inspect the other. And so you'd have a woman there with the young lady and a man there with the older man there with the young man. And the young man and the young woman would strip, and they would inspect one another, make sure they were getting what they were supposed to be getting. Going, great. Yeah, so that literally, nothing to be covered. If a couple were found to have been promiscuous, that they had participated in premarital sex, that was a crime. And they would be unallowed to marry ever anyone. And they would be monitored to make sure they never had premarital sex with anyone else ever again. So in Utopia, if you decide to have premarital sex, you better make sure it was really, really good, because you are never going to have it again. Which, of course, kept people from, okay, it's not worth this one time. No. So they controlled every aspect of life. Well, the question is, does Moore mean this seriously? That the government should have this much control? This is how the world should operate? Or is it instead a satire? Now, of course, this idea about premarital sex not being allowed, part of that stems, he was a very staunch Catholic. The idea about attitudes toward that was part of the Catholic faith. And so he may really mean that part, but we shouldn't have that. Now, the consequences of it, maybe he being a little more facetious about it. But Moore is one of those individuals who writes this book, and it has become sort of, is this a commentary on how the world should be, or is it something else? Moore gets into trouble because he opposes Henry VIII. I mentioned to you last time about how Henry VIII was a defender of the Catholic Church, Catholic faith. He wrote a long treatise against Martin Luther and the Protestants, the Reformation proposals that had come up, and the Pope had rewarded him with the Order of the Pope, or the Champion of the Faith. Actually, Order of the Faith is what it was called, I believe. Proclaimed him a Champion of the Faith. And then, of course, in 1530s, he wants to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so that he can marry someone else and have a son. And he appeals to the Pope. Your book calls it a divorce. It's not a divorce. It's actually an annulment, but okay, divorce. Maybe a term that Fierro thinks most people can relate to. Annulment, maybe you don't quite understand as well. In the Catholic faith, the divorce meant, yes, the marriage is ended, but neither party can remarry. An annulment in the Catholic faith means the marriage essentially never existed, and both parties are free to remarry. It's a little technical difference, but Anyway, he's trying to get rid of his first wife so he can marry somebody else. And the Pope won't let him, so he separates the Church of England from the Catholic Church and creates the Anglican Church, the Anglican faith. And he tells everybody, you've all got to take a vow to the Church of England, and I'm the head of the Church of England, so you're going to take this vow to the Church of England. And Thomas More refused. Remember, I think I made the comment sort of jokingly, they went to bed one night Catholic, and they woke up the next day and they were told, you're no longer Catholics, you're Anglican. And then, but I don't want to be an Anglican, I'm a Catholic. Well, then you get out of the country or something else will happen to you. Well, I guess I'll be an Anglican. More said, I'm not going to be an Anglican. And he was imprisoned. And eventually he was beheaded because of his perseverance in his faith. I don't think it mentions this in your book. No, it really doesn't say too much about it. Well, on page 213 it does. It gives you that little first look. It says, originally dressing, because that's his picture at the start of the chapter. Was led to the scaffold, beheaded for high treason. And Henry's supremacy of the church. More was tried, convicted, put to death. What it doesn't say in the book, supposedly, as he approached the scaffold and was kneeling to have his head chopped off, he supposedly asked the individual, the executioner, is his hair too much in the way? Would you like me to expose my neck better? Would you, he was very conscientious of, I don't want to cause you any misconvenience, so you don't get a clean hit. Do I need to move my hair away and make it a better shot for you to hit my neck? Like, okay, that's what we're all going to worry about, is you're about to get beheaded, making it easier for the guy who's going to chop off your head. But More was an individual who offers this concept, and it makes it interesting. Is this really what we're supposed to see? Is this really what we're supposed to understand about government? So Erasmus and More are offering commentaries about the follies of men, a very common theme in this era, where they're looking at how men are. One of the earliest plays that Shakespeare writes, for instance, this is in the 1590s, is a comedy of errors, where he takes a setting in Greece, and he basically shows how foolish people can be. And many of his plays do that. In fact, at one time in one of his plays, Midsummer Night's Dream, anybody here have to read Midsummer Night's Dream? What fools these mortals be? Puck makes a comment. Well, this is part of what we see as a very common theme among these writers of the Northern Renaissance. They're looking at man, capital M, mankind, and saying, okay, we're capable of so much. Look at what all we can do, and then look where it takes us. Look what we wind up doing. We get caught up into wars. For what reason? Because this individual's a Catholic, this individual's a Protestant now, and we're going to fight about it. Or this person has a tract of land, and this other person says, I think I would like that tract of land. Well, why? Again, that's part of what utopia looks at. This idea about people fighting wars over land. Well, there is no ownership of land in utopia. Nobody gets to own land. It's all just set as belonging to the utopians fully. This idea about foolishness is also part of other writings. You have a few paragraphs in your book about Cervantes. Anybody here ever read Don Quixote? Anybody here ever heard of Don Quixote? Technically, it was not called a novel. It's peccadillo. It is a novel. But have you ever heard the expression tilting at windmills? Ever heard that? Ever seen an image of a knight on a sort of broken down horse with a lance charging at a windmill? Okay, well, never mind. But that's, you folks just don't get around with that. Don Quixote is a work. Cervantes wrote other works as well, but it's Don Quixote for which he's remembered. It talks about a man who reads, and he reads especially about the romances, about knights. Remember the romances like Song of Roland, the El Cid. He reads all these romances about the knights and their exploits to the point where he gets overwhelmed and he gets a brain fever. And when he awakens from his fever, he thinks he is a knight. And he renames himself Don Quixote de la Mancha. The subsequence of that is that he promptly goes around and acts as a knight would. Well, the only horse he has is one called Rosamonde, and it's a swayback horse. It's old and has a swayed back. And he goes off, and the only armor he gets are old and rusted, and his lance is not in good shape or anything like that. And the result is that really what Cervantes is doing is making fun about all these great aspects of knights and what they're supposed to be like, and how they seem to really have lost their true calling. Remember I told you the knights gradually, as the feudal era has changed, they become more courtiers than warriors. But they're all still expected to fight, but they're more caught up in how they look and their appearance, etc., than what they're really supposed to be doing. Well, Don Quixote, though, goes around and tries to help the poor, tries to help those who are in need, and he sees people in need. Of course, he has to be knighted first, and he recognizes he has not gone through his vigil properly to be considered a knight. So as he's riding along, he sees a castle ahead of him, clearly run by a noble lord. And there are noble ladies there. He rides through and talks to the noble ladies, and he approaches the noble owner of the lord of the castle and asks for him to knight him, because he needs to be, fulfill his obligation to be considered a true knight. And this noble lord, who actually is the owner of an inn, a tavern, and the ladies are actually the local prostitutes who are hanging around, says, sure, go out by the well and stay there all night and strip yourself of all your armor and stay out there in the cold by yourself. And they just laugh about him. So, of course, he's knighted the next day after he's been out there in the chill in his underwear. And so he goes off to, they basically toss him out. But he feels he's been knighted. He goes off and he attacks some people because he feels they're being oppressive and hurting others. And, of course, they beat him up, and tie him to his horse and send him back home. He is back at his house, and he awakens again. And his local priest and his daughter have decided that they need to get rid of all these books, and so they burn them all. Book burning. Consequence is that he gets ready to go off again, though. This time when he goes off, he realizes as a knight he has to have a squire. So he recruits a local peasant named Sancho Panza with a promise that, listen, you go off with me. Remember in the Crusades they were always promising people, you go off, we're going to make sure you come back wealthy. He promises Sancho Panza, you come off with me as my squire, I will train you in the ways of knighthood, and you will eventually have your own estate. your own place to be in charge. And so Sancho goes off with him. And things just never quite work out. We'll end this one, and your book makes this comment about it. You have Alonso Quezada, that's the name of it. He escapes the hypocrisy and worldliness of his own age by immersing himself in the literature of the past. That Cervantes offers the exploits of the would-be knight and Sancho Panza as a tragic comedy. In effect, both humorous and poignant. When the first part of Don Quixote ends, he has come back home, and he is there. Well, there's a second part for Don Quixote that's written. That's several years later that Cervantes writes it, primarily because Don Quixote, his first part, had been so popular that other people had started writing sequels to it. Now, of course, this is an era where you don't have copyright. So literally people are writing about his characters and having him do all sorts of things, some of which he did not approve of what they were having his character do. And so to prevent this from happening anymore, Cervantes writes part 2 of Don Quixote. So that if you ever want to read Don Quixote, there's a part 1 and a part 2. It's about 900 pages. You're all going, great, just what we want to go do. Weekend reading. And so in part 2, he has Don Quixote and Sancho go off again. There's several telling comments. They wind up at one land run by a duke and a duchess. And they're making fun of him constantly, and they think it'll be really, really funny to let Sancho Panza rule their land for a day or so. Let him have a chance to rule, and they'll think, oh my gosh, how this peasant is going to run the country, and they'll think about what he's going to do and how foolish he's going to look when he does it. Here's the problem. Sancho Panza does an excellent job of running the country. He makes very good decisions. He listens to the people. He addresses their needs. He tries to actually do something rather than just make use of it, as the Duke and the Duchess have been doing. They basically haven't worried too much about it. They just enjoy the benefits of being the Duke and the Duchess. Sancho actually takes a caring attitude, which does not sit well with the Duke and the Duchess, as you can probably imagine. Well, in that, then, Cervantes is making a commentary about the nature of government, just as satirically as Moore and Erasmus had done about the follies of mankind, that we get caught up because of our position, our names, etc. Well, why does that qualify you to rule? What are you really doing? Or are you instead being foolish because you're not doing what is needed, you're only benefiting from it, you're only exploiting it? And as such, it's a telling moment. Some of the best moments in either part 1 or part 2 are the moments when Sancho Panza and Don Quixote are riding along. And Don Quixote talks to Sancho and tells them about the world and what the world is like and how the world is prone to error. Those are really good moments where we see Cervantes using that character to discuss. And the next thing you know, he's charging a flock of sheep because he thinks it's two armies battling each other, which upsets the shepherds to no end. But, that happens. Or he's charging a windmill because he thinks it's a giant. And he gets his lance caught up in the blades of the windmill, and he's lifted off of his horse, and he's going around and around. And he gets thrown off of it and bruised. At the end of part 2, though, because, again, Cervantes is going to make certain that nobody can write any more about his character of Don Quixote. Don Quixote is taken home ill, and he awakens, and he's now no longer thinking he's Don Quixote. He's back being Don Alonso Quezada. And he proclaims that everything is foolishness. You have to quote your book. This world is nothing but schemes and plots, all working at cross purposes. So this is how the world is. It's all foolishness. Nobody is really trying to do anything except benefit themselves. Because, of course, as a true knight, you don't benefit yourself. You try to help those who are in need. And Cervantes makes a very telling commentary then about the world in that work. And it's a very good work. It is a novel, but technically it's not considered a novel because the novel really didn't exist per se.